Hello, sir, and welcome to Your Masculine Tribe, the podcast where I ask the questions that help you identify, cultivate, and apply principles of masculinity. I'm your host, Todd Michael. Today we explore what is meant by the label toxic masculinity and challenge the assumption that all masculinity is toxic. I'm glad you're here. Is toxic masculinity real? Is it a hoax? You may know what the words toxic and masculinity mean, but what meaning do they take on when paired together? What is toxic masculinity? Well, gentlemen, as with most things nowadays, the answer you'll get largely depends on who you ask. Some erroneously expand it to encompass most of what is meant to be a man. That is to say, the idea that all masculinity is toxic. But who's responsible for this concept? In one camp, you have extreme feminists who want to use toxic masculinity as a battering ram with which they can break down all masculinity, or quote unquote, the patriarchy. All males and their fragile egos are the cause of every problem in society, literally. I also hear it from men who want to dismiss the idea of toxic masculinity entirely by creating a sort of straw man broad definition that they can easily debunk. Toxic masculinity? Psh, masculinity isn't toxic. Do whatever you want, bro. Are they really behind this idea? Maybe, or at least behind promoting it. No matter who's behind it, expanding the definition of toxic masculinity to include all masculinity, thereby implying that the only way to combat it is to be against all forms of masculinity, is really a non sequitur. Now, what about in academia? How is the term toxic masculinity used there? In most instances, toxic masculinity refers to the suppression of emotion and engendering habits of harmful violence among boys and men. But let's unpack each of those a little bit. I mentioned in the last episode that the suppression of emotion, or stoicism, is actually quite common and healthy in men in certain temperamental predispositions. In fact, there are the guys who aren't actually suppressing their emotions as much as their need to express them just isn't as strong as others. They tend to be the lone wolf types who appreciate the men in their tribe for utility, but don't necessarily feel the need to express that appreciation every 2 minutes. This doesn't mean they lack feeling, it just means they don't show it in the same way as some other men. Do you identify with that description? Why or why not? Of course, there are also other men who express their emotions freely and frequently. These are the guys that have sincere empathy for others, often emote more dramatically than those around them, and tend to gravitate toward relationships that welcome outward expressions of appreciation and affection. Did I just describe you? How would you define your own emotional competency? You might be wondering then if it's natural for some men to suppress emotion more often than not, and for other men to express emotion more often than not. Why on earth are we calling any of it toxic? Isn't it just normal for everyone to do whatever comes naturally? If all men are not the same, and they most certainly are not, what's toxic then is the unrealistic expectations we place on men with different temperaments. Is asking an emotionally reserved boy or man to force emotions any less toxic than asking an emotionally expressive boy or man to, quote, suck it up? The missing factor in most of these conversations is considering individual temperament. I'm going to keep beating that drum, guys. We have arbitrarily assigned so much to gender differences, and we are leaving out the very important ways in which people can be different and alike, regardless of their sex at birth. Neither gender is a monolith. I can't think of anything more masculine than giving your brothers space to express who they genuinely are while still having their back. If your buddy emotes differently than you, so what? Who cares? He's your brother, and what matters is that he's a principled man with respect for himself and for you. Don't be ashamed of your differences. Lean into them. We need more of this, gents. We can do better than the current level of isolation many men feel because they have a different temperament than the guys around them. Again, it's the narrow mindedness that can be toxic. Eliminate that and you're good to go. Now let's consider the idea of boys and men engendering habits of harmful violence. How does violence relate to toxic masculinity? Right off, let's get something straight. Violence or threats thereof against the defenseless is pathetic and shameful. Domestic violence, rape, child abuse, and animal cruelty have no place in the lives of a truly masculine man. Period. There is no excuse for it, and it is not to be tolerated in ourselves or in our brothers, and we should do everything in our power to get help for those of us who take part in any of it in any form. In a word, this behavior is truly toxic. What I do find interesting is that most boys and men who end up getting into physical fights with each other or damage property or lose their temper easily are often lacking a genuine outlet for their natural masculine energy. Couldn't the same even be said for those drawn to violent gaming? So, what is natural masculine energy? How do men find healthy ways to express it? I know I'm going to offend some people with what I'm about to say, but that is not my intention. I believe in science. Can we just admit that men and women are genetically unique and distinct from each other? A moment ago, I said that we can't ignore the ways men and women can be similar by overemphasizing gender without the context of temperament. And we also can't ignore the way men and women are fundamentally different. How? Noting the rare genetic conditions that can and do exist, we as men have significantly more testosterone in our bodies than women. That testosterone is a beautiful thing. It can fuel great valor. It can inspire a man to accomplish what has never been accomplished. It can even build one's stature to become larger and stronger than he was the year before. It can also be our downfall if we don't learn to bridle it. Are you hearing what I'm saying here? So much of what gets us into trouble as boys and men is a misapplication of a primal drive to protect ourselves, our families, and our tribe. This is why physical fitness, weight training, and organized sports, especially combat sports, can be incredibly healthy for boys and men. Is there any better 100% natural non toxic outlet for our very healthy masculine drive to compete and to conquer? This desire, of course, like everything else, will be more prevalent in some men than others, depending on their individual, yeah, you guessed it, temperament. So, what about those screaming that we need to address toxic masculinity and others stubbornly insisting masculinity is not toxic? Well, the elusive truth is that they're both right. We need more of the masculine and less of the toxic. I'll say it again, gentlemen. We need more of the masculine and less of the toxic. You cannot erase one without increasing the other, and you most certainly should not try to erase both. We need to be better at respecting individual temperament and giving men space and opportunities to connect with other men within their tribe. We need to work together to cultivate masculinity through common principles like knowledge, honesty, valor, integrity, vigor, utility, and command. Masculinity does not have to become toxic, and it does not have to be canceled. It's up to each one of us to ensure that neither of those things happen. And that's where we'll leave it for today. If you recognize that the world needs more masculine men, and that masculinity is not inherently toxic, head on over to masculinetribe.com and join the tribe today. We need you, and we want to help you become the man you know you were meant to be. Until next time, gents, don't be toxic and be masculine.